War does not reward obedience alone. It rewards those who understand men, how they think, how they break, and what makes them follow someone into darkness. In every army, there is a quiet struggle between order and effectiveness, between polish and survival. Few stories expose that conflict more brutally than the rise, fall, and resurrection of Terry de la Mesa Allen, a general celebrated by the public, despised by parts of his own command, and nearly erased by the very system he helped save. August 9, 1943. Across the United States, Americans stopped at newsstands and stared at a familiar face. Time magazine had placed Major General Terry Allen on its cover, praising him as a rising star, an infantry commander gaining stature with every battlefield success. According to the article, Allen was exactly the kind of leader the Army needed. There was only one problem. By the time the magazine reached the public, Terry Allen no longer had a job. 2 days earlier, on August 7th, General Omar Bradley had relieved him of command. Allen had just seized the town of Troina, one of the bloodiest, most brutal fights of the Sicilian campaign. His 1st Infantry Division had prevailed in every major engagement in North Africa and Sicily. His men played a decisive role in stopping a German counterattack that, combined with naval gunfire and air support, prevented the Allied invasion from being pushed back into the sea. None of that mattered. Bradley sent him home in disgrace, citing discipline and command control issues, including Allen's tolerance for poor uniform standards and his disregard for conventional military order. So while newspapers hailed Terry Allen as one of America's finest combat commanders, he was already aboard a transport ship, heading back across the Atlantic in humiliation. The timing was catastrophic. Bradley fired him on August 7th. Time hit the stands on August 9th with Allen on the cover. The general who had just been dismissed was being celebrated as a national hero. It was a public relations disaster, and it caught the attention of someone far more powerful than Bradley. George C. Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff, was watching, and Marshall was about to offer Terry Allen something Bradley never imagined he would receive: a second chance. Terry Allen's life in uniform began long before World War II. He entered West Point in 1907, born into a family steeped in military tradition. His father was an Army colonel. His grandfather had fought at Gettysburg with the Garibaldi Guard. 4 generations of Allens had worn the uniform, but Terry didn't fit the mold. He suffered from severe dyslexia, making reading slow and painful. He compensated through sheer memory, but academics were a constant uphill battle. He failed out of West Point, not once, but twice. For most men, that would have been the end of the road. The message was clear: the Army didn't want them. Allen refused to accept that verdict. He enrolled at Catholic University in Washington, completed ROTC, and earned a commission in 1912, entering the Army through what many regular officers sneered at as the back door. They never let him forget it. He wasn't one of them. He hadn't earned his place the proper way. Allen didn't care. He was exactly where he wanted to be. Over the next 3 decades, he would prove, again and again, that classroom performance meant very little once the shooting started. World War I transformed Terry Allen into a legend among enlisted men, and a nightmare for his superiors. At just 30 years old, he commanded an infantry battalion. He personally led patrols into no man's land, ignoring regulations that said battalion commanders belonged behind the lines. During the Meuse-Argonne offensive, a machine gun round ripped through his jaw. Most officers would have accepted evacuation. Allen talked the doctors into releasing him early. He returned to the front with the wound barely closed, still bleeding. His men didn't know whether to admire him or worry about him. In the end, they did both. His superiors, however, were furious. He drank too much. He dismissed regulations he considered pointless. He treated ceremony as wasted time better spent training for combat. Yet no matter how much he irritated headquarters, one fact couldn't be denied: Allen won. Every fight his battalion entered ended in victory. After the armistice, Allen drifted through the peacetime army, moving between cavalry posts, getting into trouble, getting out of it, and building a reputation as the officer you wanted beside you in battle, and nowhere else. Then George Marshall noticed him. By 1940, Lieutenant Colonel Terry Allen was once again in serious trouble, being dressed down by his regimental commander and facing the possibility of court-martial. Then a telegram arrived. Allen had been promoted to brigadier general, skipping the permanent rank of colonel entirely. Marshall had intervened personally. The Army Chief of Staff was rebuilding a force for the war he knew was coming. He didn't want parade ground perfection. He wanted leaders who could fight. Marshall described Allen as an outstanding commander who could do anything with men and officers, despite his rough appearance and seemingly casual manner. Other generals thought Marshall had lost his mind. Allen was a known problem, a drinker, a rule breaker, a man who had failed out of West Point twice. But Marshall saw what others missed. He understood that wars were not won by soldiers who marched perfectly, but by soldiers who trusted their commander enough to follow him anywhere. In May 1942, Marshall handed Allen command of the 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One of the most coveted posts in the Army. It was also the moment Allen crossed paths with the man who would come closest to ending his career. Major General Omar Bradley was everything Allen was not. A West Point graduate, precise, cautious, deeply committed to order and proper procedure. To Bradley, discipline was the foundation of combat effectiveness. When Bradley assumed command of 2 corps in North Africa, Allen's division fell under his authority. What Bradley saw disturbed him. The soldiers of the Big Red One were sloppy. Salutes were inconsistent. Uniforms were filthy. They fought in rear area towns, clashed with military police, and treated authority as an inconvenience. Bradley later wrote that Allen's division left behind looted wine shops and furious mayors wherever it went. What he rarely emphasized was this. When German forces struck at Kasserine Pass and American units broke and ran, Allen's division held. When 2 corps needed men to counterattack, it was Allen's soldiers who went forward. Bradley admitted, reluctantly, that no one surpassed Terry Allen in leading troops in combat. But he said it through clenched teeth. Because to Bradley, visible discipline and institutional order were inseparable from combat effectiveness. North Africa taught Terry Allen a lesson that would shape everything that followed. Night attacks worked. By day, German artillery and machine guns shredded advancing infantry. Open ground became killing fields. But at night, visibility vanished, and with it, German precision. Allen understood that darkness neutralized the enemy's advantages. He transformed his division's training, far beyond the Army's prescribed training schedule, often consuming most available hours each week. His men learned to move without light, navigate by compass and stars, and launch attacks without speaking a word. The results were immediate. At El Guetar, Allen's night assaults disrupted German formations and neutralized their ability to fight effectively in darkness. The 10th Panzer Division was forced to withdraw after suffering heavy losses against an enemy it couldn't see. Bradley watched Allen's victories accumulate, and so did the discipline reports. The tension between them only grew, along with Bradley's determination to finally put a stop to Terry Allen. July 1943. Sicily. The Allies came ashore under 2 banners. General George Patton led the American 7th Army. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery commanded Britain's 8th. For the most dangerous landing zone, Gila, Patton made a specific demand. He wanted Terry Allen and the 1st Infantry Division. Patton knew exactly what he was asking for. Allen's men could take punishment and give it back. They landed on July 10th. Within hours, German armor from the Hermann Göring Division surged forward, nearly 90 tanks driving straight for the beaches, intent on hurling the Americans back into the sea before the invasion could take hold. Allen's division stopped them. Years later, Omar Bradley would make a rare and telling admission. He questioned whether any other American division could have broken that armored charge in time to save the landing. Let that sit for a moment. The man who would soon fire Terry Allen quietly acknowledged that Allen's troops may have been the only force capable of preventing disaster in Sicily, but Allen was never content with merely surviving. Once the beaches were secure, he drove inland with relentless aggression, shattering the German defensive center and opening the way for Patton's army to race Montgomery toward Messina. His soldiers were exhausted. Losses climbed. Allen pushed them anyway. He believed momentum mattered more than comfort. On August 6th, after 6 days of savage, close-quarters fighting, the 1st Infantry Division captured the town of Troina. It was among the bloodiest battles of the entire Sicilian campaign. For most generals, this would have been the crowning achievement of a career. For Terry Allen, it became the end. August 7th, 1943. Allen was ordered to report to 2 Corps headquarters. Omar Bradley was waiting. The exchange was short. Allen was relieved of command of the 1st Infantry Division. His assistant division commander, Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., the former president's son, was relieved as well. The official explanation was discipline. Bradley said Allen had become too much of an individualist, unable to subordinate himself to the collective machinery of modern war. Allen was stunned. His division had just taken Troina. They had never lost a major engagement in North Africa or Sicily. Now he was being sent home for dirty uniforms and sloppy salutes. What he didn't know was that Time magazine had already gone to print. What he didn't know was that on August 9th, his face would appear on newsstands across America as one of the Army's greatest combat commanders. While the public celebrated him, Allen sailed home in disgrace. All he knew was that his career was finished. George Patton was furious when he heard the news. Patton and Allen had clashed constantly, over tactics, over command style, over nearly everything. They were not friends. But Patton understood battlefield reality, and he had no tolerance for generals who valued polish over results. When Eisenhower later criticized the poor discipline of Allen's division, Patton interrupted him, publicly, in front of the staff. Patton argued that Eisenhower was wrong, reportedly remarking that harsh discipline before combat could break a fighting force rather than strengthen it. It changed nothing. Eisenhower backed Bradley. Allen was done. The men of the 1st Division took the blow hard. They weren't just losing a commander. They were losing the man who ate in their mess lines, who walked the perimeter at night, who shared their risks. When Allen boarded the transport ship back to the United States, he looked nothing like a victorious general. He looked hollow. At 55 years old, the Army had decided he was finished. He didn't know George Marshall was watching. October 15th, 1943. Camp Adair, Oregon. Terry Allen stood before a formation of soldiers who bore no resemblance to the Big Red One. These were raw draftees and fresh enlistees, men who had never heard a shot fired in anger. They were the 104th Infantry Division, soon to be known as the Timberwolves. Marshall had intervened again. Barely 2 months after Bradley declared Allen unfit to command, the Army Chief of Staff handed him another division. 2 months. Bradley fires him, and before the paperwork has settled, Marshall gives him a new command. The message was unmistakable. Marshall didn't need a diplomat. He needed a fighter. Allen looked at the untested men before him and saw what others didn't. Potential. He would build them from the ground up. He would train them the way he knew worked, and he would prove that Bradley's decision had been a catastrophic mistake. Training began that afternoon. Allen rebuilt the 104th into something the Army had never fielded. While other divisions trained for daylight combat, the Timberwolves learned to live in darkness. No flashlights, no shouted orders. Hand signals replaced voices. Movements were rehearsed until every man knew his place instinctively. Allen drove them mercilessly. He was ruthless about standards, but this time, discipline wasn't about appearances. It was about lethality. Every flawless night maneuver was a quiet rebuke to the men who had dismissed him. The Timberwolves adopted a motto: "Nothing in hell must stop the Timberwolves." By August 1944, they were ready. The 104th entered combat on October 23, 1944, in the Netherlands. Allen attacked at night. His division advanced 15 miles in 5 days through flooded terrain that stalled other units. Montgomery himself sent congratulations. Then came the Siegfried Line, concrete bunkers, dragon's teeth, interlocking fire zones that had chewed up divisions attacking in daylight. Allen ignored convention. His men struck after dark. Stolberg fell. Then Eschweiler. Then Inden. Town after town taken while German defenders struggled to fight an enemy they could not see. They crossed the Roer River in a brutal night assault and pushed on toward Cologne. German prisoners began calling them the night fighters. Interrogators reported the same complaint again and again. Fighting the 104th wasn't fair. The Americans came out of nowhere. The rules didn't apply. By spring 1945, the Timberwolves crossed the Rhine and drove toward the Elbe. They had become exactly what Allen promised Marshall, one of the most feared American units for night operations in the European theater. Then they reached Nordhausen. On April 11, 1945, the 104th discovered a concentration camp. 3,000 bodies lay exposed. Another 700 survivors, starving, diseased, barely alive, had been abandoned when the SS fled. These men had been worked to death building V-2 rockets in underground tunnels. then left to die when they were no longer useful. For 6 months, the Timberwolves had owned the night. Here they confronted something darker. Hardened sergeants who had stood firm under artillery fire collapsed in those tunnels. No training, no amount of night drills, had prepared them for industrialized murder. They evacuated the survivors. They forced local civilians to bury the dead, and then they marched east with cold, unrelenting resolve. On April 26, 1945, the 104th reached the Mulder River and linked up with Soviet forces, among the first American units to do so. The war in Europe was effectively over. The Timberwolves had fought for 195 consecutive days. They rarely yielded ground and consistently regained lost positions when counterattacked. They had never failed to take an objective. The division given to Terry Allen as a consolation prize, green draftees written off by many, had become one of the most effective combat units of the war. German prisoner interrogations frequently identified the 104th as one of the most difficult American divisions to face. The cost was staggering. Nearly 5,000 casualties, over 1,000 killed. Allen wrote hundreds of letters to grieving families, each one personal, each one specific. Omar Bradley never admitted he was wrong. George Marshall didn't have to. The general, fired 2 days before appearing on Time magazine's cover, had led his 2nd Division to victory. The man who failed out of West Point twice had forged the most feared night fighting force in Europe. Bradley said Allen was too much of an individualist for coalition warfare. History delivered its verdict. In Terry Allen's war, individual leadership, not conformity, proved decisive.